Hello and welcome to the Board Game Barrage podcast, a podcast about board games, the latest hotness, and how to have fun with your friends, even when you're losing. I am Kellen, the red tank, joined by Neelan and Mark, orange and green with envy. Say hello, respectively.
Yeah.
There's nothing respectful about you, Mark.
That's true. Hello, everybody.
Say hello.
Hello.
Today on the Board Game Barrage podcast, we're going to cover the games that we've been playing lately and a featured topic. And today's featured topic is inspired by a famous quote that no one can attribute to anyone.
No, I think it's
No?
definitely Picasso.
It's not. Google it. I guarantee.
No, it's Picasso or Warhol.
It's
Mark Twain,
it's
isn't it?
famously attributed to Picasso, but it's not. It's not like a fact.
Oh, interesting.
So Google
Neelan
it.
coming in here thinking he knows what he's talking about.
I'm gonna look this up. now.
Steve
I've
Jobs has
always-
said it. Anyway, well, we haven't even said the quote. Neelan, do you know how podcasts work? The quote is good artists copy and great artists steal. So we're going to be talking about that, how people are inspired by other games, whether they credit them in the rulebook or not. But before we get to that spicy inspiration, we're going to cover the games we've been playing. Mark is going to kick us off with Lorenzo, the card game. I am going to take us to Innovation, Ultimate Edition, and or 4th Edition, dun 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 dun, pre-Kickstarter coverage. And Neelan will wrap us up with the unfortunately titled Dawn of Ulos. I dare you to try to remember that 2 minutes after this ends. Mark, Lorenzo.
Yes. Now, speaking of unfortunate titles, Kellen was unfortunately a little incorrect with the title of this game, but I don't blame him. This isn't Lorenzo El Magnifico, the card game. It is, in terms of, if you're looking up on BGG, it is Masters of Renaissance, Lorenzo El Magnifico, the card game.
A colon and a
my
dash.
God.
As we've showed, get a lot of colons. Colons have become sort of like common fare around here, but how many dashes do you get? Not very many, I don't think.
How many colons and dashes?
Exactly, yeah, you get a double feature.
In one.
In one title. So this is designed by Nestor Mangoni and Simone Luciani. Luciani also being part of the design team behind the quote-unquote big brother of this game, Lorenzo El Magnifico. Use the quote-unquotes there because while this game purports to be the card game version of Lorenzo, I have to say it both isn't super Lorenzo El Magnifico-like, and it's really not much of a card game. So you got two lies right there on the front of the box. So interesting in both the colon dashness of it and also the double lie of it. So you've got a lot of stuff going on right in the box cover, which is interesting. Anyhow, let's briefly touch on why this isn't very much like Lorenzo. Well, in many ways it is. However, they're mostly shallow ways. The art, as you might imagine, is extremely similar in style to the original Lorenzo. Same goes for the resources. The stone, wood, coins, servants, and faith are all carryovers from the original game, Lorenzo Magnifico. More importantly, there is an engine building quality in Lorenzo that is also here. And whereas it was parts, albeit an important part of the original game, it is absolutely the focus of this game. It's basically all this game is. I think most crucially in where they differ are the relative tightnesses also of the game. Lorenzo is quite a tight game. It's very punishing. And you don't really get very much of that in Masters of the Renaissance. Likewise, as I mentioned earlier, it's not really a card game because while there are cards, each player has their own player boards, and most wonderfully, actually, there is a central gimmick of this game, the marble holder. So this isn't at all a card game in the sense that you'd be able to like pop it open at a bar or restaurant and just be able to like play it out of your hands for the most part. This is going to take up, while not an overwhelming, a fair amount of table space. But anyway, talked about enough about what this game isn't. Let's talk about what you are doing in Masters of the Renaissance. And sorry, it's not actually Masters of the Renaissance. I keep saying this, but it's Masters of Renaissance. So a lot of confusion, again, on this box cover. I can't stress that enough. On your turn, you'll have one of three choices. So your choices are pretty simple. Take resources from this marble holder that I mentioned, buy a card, which is a building basically, or activate your engine. So again, very straightforward, three choices. So let's talk about the star of the show, which is the taking resources action. The way it works is that you'll have this shared plastic contraption between you and your opponents that holds different colored marbles in a 3x4 grid. You'll have two of those marbles in gold representing the gold resources, two of the marbles are brown representing wood, and so on. And you'll have one represent faith, which is another sort of resource, but not in the way that the other ones are, where they're sort of building resources. This is a different one. And then there are three white marbles that represent nothing. They're blank. And on your turn, you pick any one of the rows or any one of the columns, and you take the appropriate resources. So if I take a column that has a purple, a red, and a white ball, I get one servant, which is the purple ball. I get one on the faith track, which is the red ball, and then that's it because, again, the white ball counts as nothing. Then you pop the last ball out of whatever row or column you selected. You pop in a new ball, and those are the new choices for the next player. Then you'll have a choice to make because storing the resources that you get from this marble machine thing is restrictive. You can only hold one of one type of resource, two of another type, and three of a third type. So you're very limited in how you can store them. And if you ever take more resources than you can hold, not only are they wasted, but your opponents get to move up on their faith track one spot for each piece that you can't hold. So you might have a really juicy row or column that will allow you to get full resources, but if you have no room to store them, you definitely don't want to go there because you're going to be moving up your opponents and you're not going to be able to store them yourself. So that's what the white blanks sort of come in handy. Anyhow, so you get these resources, and then you use those resources for that second option I mentioned earlier, which is buying the cards, which again are the buildings. The cards come in 4 colors and 3 levels. So level 1 cards, 2 and 3, and you'll have 3 spots on your board in which to build them. Each card has a conversion on it that you'll be able to perform if and when you run your engines. And the higher the level of the cards, going from like 1 to 3, the better the conversion. So if I buy a level 1 card, I have access to this new part of the engine that I can run. But if I buy a level 2 card, I get a better conversion, but I have to like place that level 2 card on top of the level 1 card, and I lose that first conversion. So that's basically what you're doing. And then finally, the last thing you can do on your turn is to run those engines that you've built up. And this is basically just conversions. You convert 1 or 2 types of goods into more goods and or faith points. And not only are you doing these because the conversions are always beneficial in terms of the number of things you're getting, but anything that you produce from this engine conversion part of the game is stored in a separate place on your board that doesn't have the restrictions I mentioned earlier, where you can only keep so many of each resource. Anything you generate from this engine that you run is saved in a different spot without any restriction at an unlimited quality. So it's a much looser sort of production. You're doing this until either one person builds their 7th building or one person makes it up all the way on their faith track, and then you tally up the points, and that's Masters of Renaissance. Whereas Lorenzo is like your full-fledged 2-hour standard midweight to heavy-ish Euro. Masters of Renaissance is fast. We got this game taught and played in about an hour, and I could definitely see games of this averaging 45 minutes, if not a little quicker. So I think it plays right in the sort of Splendor area in terms of length, but also in terms of this is a very Splendory game because they're both about resource conversion. And while I think I prefer Splendor to this, in fact, I know I prefer Splendor to this, I did enjoy my plays of Masters of Renaissance. The marble resource thing is 100% a gimmick, but it's a really fun, effective one. It works. It's not too cumbersome. It's very clear. And it's an engine builder, the game itself is, where you're able to set up your engine quickly and see the fruits of that labor within minutes. You can see what you're building, and you're going to be able to fire off that engine shortly thereafter. And there are interesting decisions to be made for sure, not only in like picking the marbles, but whether you want to focus on engines or whether to move up your faith track, or if you go for like a building strategy. And then if you go for a building strategy, are you going to build like multiple cheaper buildings so you can have more different types of conversions? Or are you going to go to like a narrow focus where you're going to focus on one building that might just give you one conversion, but like maybe a level 3 conversion, which is a stronger one? So if you're a fan of engine builders, in the vein again of Splendor or Century Spice Road or that kind of thing, and that same sort of length and relative weight, I think you're going to enjoy Masters of Renaissance. The whole Renaissance thing and the relative like earthy tone of this game and the palette of this game do make it look and feel a little generic, but the marbles are cool. And again, the engine building is quick and simple to teach and fun to play. So yeah, that is Masters of Renaissance by Simone Luciani, Nestor Mangoni, and published by Cranio Creations.
Does it feel like Lorenzo?
Not really, because the feeling I have with Lorenzo is really tight decisions. Like the engine building in Lorenzo is excruciatingly difficult to make. If you're the first person to buy a card from a column, you buy it at the card cost, but if you're going to buy it when somebody else has gone there, it's prohibitively expensive, and like running the engine feels like a fight each time. This is much looser. So it does insofar as you are building up an engine, but whereas Lorenzo, you're trying to crank that engine once per round, and maybe you'll do it 4 times per game. In Masters, it's like you build, run it, build, run it, build, run it, a lot of stuff like that. So not exactly, but there is the very, very clear similarity when it comes to the aesthetics and like the resources. And I think that's maybe enough to make it feel Lorenzo-y. Because just the theme being the same, you do get the Lorenzo vibes, if only in the aesthetics.
You're telling me after all of that, Masters of Renaissance, Lorenzo Magnifico - the card game is trying to be a Splendor killer?
Oh, interesting. Maybe it is. I have not seen any references to it being a Splendor killer, but it's definitely sort of in the gang of potential Splendor killers.
A Splendor is confident. It has a one-word title.
That's true.
Masters of Renaissance, Lorenzo Magnifico - the card game. Not confident. It has no confidence.
I feel like to be a Splendor killer, you can't have this many things. You can't have unique player boards. It's too close to a board game. Splendor, you get the cards, and then you get some sort of currency. Like Century Spice Road, you got the cards, you got the jewels, or you got the spice cubes, or whatever they are. That's enough to be fighting with Splendor. This is like a little bit different.
I just can't believe they even tried.
I know.
All right. It is exciting times to be able to talk about new innovation content. Thank you to Asmati Games for sending us preview copies, which is no small task. I think they're printing these out for us, which is a lot of cards with multiple expansions. Innovation, for those who don't know, is Christina and my favorite board game of all time. And Innovation Ultimate is a new big box. Again, I don't actually know how they're kickstarting it. It's essentially the 4th edition, right? We got the 3rd edition up and around the deluxe edition that was also a Kickstarter. So this is the 4th edition that has changes to the base game and changes to all expansions, as well as a new expansion called Unseen. So that means there's renovations. I'm getting lost in my words here. There is updates to all the expansions: Artifacts of History, City of Destiny, Echoes of the Past, Figures in the Sand, and then the new expansion Unseen. So what has changed, and should I get this? So essentially now, instead of going to age 10, the base game of Innovation, and I believe all the expansions, go to age 11. I don't know if this is like a Spinal Tap reference, which I don't like. Anyway, age 11 is called Prudence. And if you thought the powers in 10 were crazy, just wait till you see the powers in 11. A lot of the changes in the base set, from what I can tell, and again, total caveats, I've only played this a few times. I have cross-compared quite a bit of the cards from the 3rd edition to this edition, but I am not some kind of Grandmaster expert, but a lot of the cards seem based around sort of getting you closer to these ending ages. So there's a new concept called junking. Typically, you would return a card to a reserve pile, but now you can junk cards out of the game, which, if you know, when you go to draw, you always draw from the available pile or higher if there's none available in that pile. So cards that allow you to junk cards out of the game are increasing the speed at which you get to the later cards in the deck, which is fun and exciting and something weird to play with. There's also the ability to junk available achievements, which was really something that Christina was super annoyed by because she had a ton of scorecards in her score pile in one of our games, and instead of her achieving, I was just junking them. So I wasn't doing anything for myself, but I was just preventing her from achieving, which was hilarious and something that we both really enjoyed. There's some rejiggering of the icons. I believe there's a new icon specifically in age 10 and 11 that coincides with one of the expansions. But largely what this is doing is trying to simplify how many new concepts are in each expansion, and a graphical, not a redesign, which I think many people would say they want, but definitely a bigger font and better. I would say it's better looking. I would say it's marginally different than the 3rd edition, but again, there's just been marginal changes over time. So as base Innovation is concerned, I have no objections, totally recommending this. I'm super excited. I will back the all-in Kickstarter, get everything, upgrade my edition. Again, I can't speak to whether the 3rd edition or the 4th edition is just better. I know Chudiak is heavily involved in doing all of these changes, so I have full faith that it is balanced. The Asmati team is like great at this stuff, so I have full faith that the 4th edition will become my de facto way to play the game, and will recommend it to everyone on the podcast and every Top 50 Countdown moving forward. I would recommend they just get the 4th edition over the 3rd edition.
One thing I'm curious about, like, I think you sort of alluded to this in the beginning, and then it's unclear how this is being sold, but is there any sense that this will be sold in parts? Because trading a tiny 3rd edition box for a bigger 4th edition box is something as an infrequent innovation player I'm a little bit hesitant about.
Yeah, I don't know if we use the last Kickstarter. Innovation Deluxe was what they did for 3rd edition, and now we're at Innovation Ultimate Edition. There was a way to get just that base SKU, and then there was a way to get the full SKU with all of the products.
Got it.
And then they went back and released them. It's possible in this case you may have to wait. And to your point, I would not recommend a new Innovation player get all the expansions. I would not 100,000,000% recommend that that's how you would start in Innovation. And honestly, like, I wouldn't tell you to buy 4th edition. I don't think you need it, to be honest with you.
I'm intrigued by some of the changes. So I think some of that hinges on how it's packaged, I guess. But no, that's cool.
So, as a person who has never played any of the expansions, I get the sense that you're saying that part of the 4th edition is it's like trying to integrate more smoothly with the expansions. Is that correct?
I think that the first Innovation expansion, Echoes, had too many new concepts in it previously and was kind of overwhelming for a first expansion. They did the Cities and Artifacts expansions, which are a little bit more single-noted. And again, I have like less than 10 plays of every expansion content, so I could totally be off on how some of those function. But my understanding is like the idea is to keep newer concepts in one expansion from like a swim lane perspective, so that things aren't sort of like carrying over between them. And so my perfect state, right, is that this actually gets me to play the expansions more, which would be an amazing change and give a lot of longevity. But it's like, I've always been skeptical of expansions to Innovation in general, frankly.
Yeah. And so another thing, you mentioned this new junking mechanism. Innovation, while it's like a wild game in terms of like the things that you're able to accomplish, does feel in some senses balanced or well calibrated. Does the introduction of this junking mechanism, do you feel like you're playing a much different game through that? Okay.
It does feel like a novel concept, because one thing, and this is what happened in the Unseen expansion, where there are things in the base game that junk entire ages. So like get rid of the full age. And so that's really going to change the tempo. Yeah. And then there was a card in Unseen that was like, switch every card in your score pile with every card in the junk pile. Okay. And so Christine and I were just desperately trying to get it because every 7 was in there. So it was like 60 or 70 points.
I see. Okay.
Of just numbers.
That's cool.
Yeah. So it is net new. My take is that there's some big nerfs of cards, and I don't really want to get into like the nuances of that.
Yeah.
And then some buffs. So the first, to me, noticeable changes are in the second age. Yellow is getting a buff via junking, which is cool. And so then, Christina and I checked out the Unseen expansion, which is going down a deep rabbit hole of innovation. Essentially, it allows you to add this mechanism called Safeguard, or a safe, where you can take a card and turn it into an available achievement for yourself. And so this gets into some of the nuances of how achieving the same numbered achievement works in Innovation. And so these are expansion concepts that you guys may not be familiar with. If you achieve Age 1 for 5 points, the second Age 1 achievement that you would achieve is double and then triple. And so what this does is it really goofs with what the available achievements are, because you're adding and taking things away from those available achievements via junking, via mechanisms within the expansion, and then you are putting cards into your available achievements to safeguard them. And then there's mechanisms that goof with cards once they're in your safe. It's small and cute. I enjoyed the added space that it gives to Innovation, but again, the length ballooned for us again, and this is on a first 2 plays, to the point where some of the cards start feeling super wacky and like really specific, and you're like, how would I ever use this? And the drawing rule is basically like any turn that you would draw a card, you start by drawing an unseen card. So the first card you draw each turn is an unseen card. This is probably not what I would suggest to people as a first expansion, but it's not the crazy end of complexity either. And so I enjoyed it. I was happy to have played it. I will continue to play it. But again, I would say 60, 70, 80% of the time, Christina and I would actually just play base, knock out a game in 30 minutes because we know it so well over including an expansion. But all things considered, super excited that this is coming back. Going all in on the Kickstarter personally, and, am happily going to recommend the 4th edition to people moving forward. An example of the card is like literally El Dorado, right? And this reminds me of some of the later age cards that are like go for broke, the card. But in this, it's draw and meld a 3, a 2, and a 1. If all 3 have a crown, score all cards in the 5 deck. So that's 10, typically 10 cards. If 2 or more have a crown, splay your green and blue cards right. So it's a little bit like shooting the moon, crazy, LOL, I'm behind, so I'm going to try some of this stuff. Just a lot of fun things happening, and it's fun to just draw the cards and see what you get. I got a secret police card, and then you try to think about the thematic reason for why it's rooting cards out of your deck, and you're like, well, this could be offensive, but also quite interesting. That is Innovation Ultimate. It's hard to remember, Innovation Ultimate or Innovation Deluxe. Maybe because this is what I do at my day job that I feel like commenting on, is this Deluxe? Is this Ultimate? We could make a Vault edition for this thing if you want, Innovation. I believe it's launching on Kickstarter the 11th of July, but you never know with these things. Super grateful to have gotten a chance. Thank you, Ismati and Chris, for sending that our way. Neelan, talk to us about another game that we don't remember the title to, The Rise of Ulos, right?
Yes, The Rise of Ulos, otherwise known as the Dawn of Ulos. Terrible, admittedly a terrible title. This is a game designed by Jason Lentz and published by Thunderworks Games. It is set in Thunderworks' fantasy universe with pre-existing games like Role Player and Cartographers, but no, that doesn't really mean anything to me. It's a pretty generic fantasy setting. Dawn of Ulos, I want to say at the bat, is, as the designer has himself stated, quite heavily inspired by Acquire. And as I'm explaining kind of the gist of it, if you've played Acquire, that will become pretty apparent. For what it's worth, I actually haven't played Acquire. So bear with me as I talk through how the way this works. You have a map of hexes that is made up of various terrain types. And in any given game, you have 5 different factions. Those factions each have a unique special power tied to their cards and different terrain types that they prefer. You have a hand of 3, what are called development tiles, which are basically just 2 hexes joined together with different terrain, each of those hexes. And on your turn, you're going to place that tile so that it matches 2 of the corresponding terrains. Okay? By doing that, you're kind of creating these larger and larger territories. If you can think of them just connected tiles that sort of start to form across the map. And when any one of those is big enough for one of the factions, like their base camp miniature, it goes covering those hexes, and that faction is now on the board. By doing that, you acquire a card in that faction's type for free. You also then have the option, after you place your tile, to buy more cards for any of the factions that are also currently on the board. So you can kind of think of that, and I'm going to use this analogy a lot, very much like buying shares in a company.
Wait, can I cut you off real quick? What is the thematic tie-in here?
We're getting there. Okay. We're getting there.
I cannot wait.
I could have started there. No. But this way, it's a mystery. Why are we buying stocks in these factions? Okay. Who can say? Okay, let's get there right now. We are gods, Mark. Gods presiding over this realm. And we're influencing these factions. We are trying to, make them be the best little orcs they could possibly be, the best little goblins they could possibly be, expand their territory, grow them out. Eventually, they'll be fighting each other. And that's very cool if you're the winning faction. Goblins suddenly take over a huge area of territory, get really, really, really powerful. And if you're invested in goblins... Sorry, not invested.
Yeah, you're influenced.
If you're the caretaker of the goblins, Mark... Yeah.
Then at the end of the game, you sell them all for money?
No. Not selling, Kellen. You're getting their favor.
Oh.
Okay. Gotcha.
So... when your goblin stocks
Wait, all those metal coins? That's not
coins,
money, that's favor?
It's favor, Calvin.
Those are beautiful metal coins.
They are quite beautiful. Okay, in all seriousness, so the idea is you're getting more investment, I guess for lack of a better word, in these factions by acquiring these cards. But one of the things that will make this different from Acquire is those cards also have those faction special powers associated with them. So on your turn, you might play one of that faction's cards for their powers. And these powers can be quite good. So there is some incentive to use effectively one of your shares in order to get some sort of benefit. You do get that factions what's called their spoils value anytime you utilize one of their cards, which will be slightly less than what it would cost to buy one of their cards. So there's a sense that you can buy their cards and then later utilize them or give them up when it comes to the battles in order to reap a slightly reduced amount of money. So let's talk about the battles. When any of these two factions merge, or whenever their two territories touch each other, you start a conflict. And one of the things that I thought was neat about this is that every player is now suddenly invested in this conflict. Because again, this is not my Goblin faction. This is not my Orc faction. These are all neutral factions that we have various levels of, care or investment in. So Mark decides he might commit some of his cards to help the Goblin faction. I might commit some of my cards to help the Orc faction. And whichever faction, or the combined total of their strength, which is based on their presence on the board, as well as any cards contributed by players, has the higher strength total at the end of that, that faction wins, takes all of the territory, and the other faction is kicked off of the board, and their strength drops all the way down to 0. You can, at that point, divest yourself of any of the cards you have at the value they were prior to them lowering their strength. So there is, again, this idea that you're effectively selling off of all of their stock once they basically get obliterated. You keep doing that until you run out of tiles or two factions have reached the highest strength value, and that's the game. You total up the amount of favor you've collected along the way, your total value of the cards you still have in hand based on the current value of all of these factions, and whoever is the most favor wins.
I have to say, obviously, it is both hilarious that the way that they're like obfuscating a stock market game. But I do think it's cool. I mean, I get you have to do these kind of things, but the fact that stock price is equal to strength of the tribe is like, it's just hilarious. But I get it. I get it.
Yeah, it's an analogy that kind of works for a little bit. There are definitely some points where you're just like, okay, this is the spoils value of the fact. It's like, well, you mean the sell price, right?
Yeah,
no. The spoils value.
Yeah.
And it does get a little bit silly in that regard because, even as I was explaining it to Callan and Christina, the first thing you say is like, let's just think of these as stocks. Like, let's just like break the illusion at the start of the game, right? Because, that is a easier analogy if you're at all familiar with this type of game. That said, I do think that the thing that was appealing about this, funnily enough, when I backed this, I wasn't even aware it had anything to do with the choir. I saw this style of neutral faction game, which is, one that we tend to like, something like an Imperial, where you're not actually any given faction, you're just manipulating them and then trying to reap the benefits of them. And I just thought that in itself was appealing. So when I sort of read the day of learning the rules that this was, very heavily inspired by a choir, I was quite intrigued by it. Callan, I'm going to jump to you for a little bit. What did you think of Dawn of Ulos?
Yeah, it's really hard to say. There's a lot of things I enjoyed in it, and a lot of those things feel like they are lifted from Acquire, and then the further we get from Acquire, the less interested in it I personally get. On your turn, also, one of the things I like about stock games and train games is how fragile they can be. Oftentimes, not always, less guardrails around what could happen, and then all of a sudden the economy is and Mark is the baron of everything, and you're just like, how does the game even let you do this? And those moments are exciting. Dawn of Ulos being in the role player universe, which is a whole nother thing that I won't comment on, no comment. It's clearly like sawing off edges of what's even like possible. So for instance, you can buy 3 stocks on your turn, or you can sell a stock, and when you sell a stock, you also get to use its ability. Even when you use cards in a battle, your shares, right? You can sell them back for their price, even when the company has gone defunct. So in Acquire, it's like, what do I do with these bad shares? Do I convert them into the, newly good company, or do I keep them in hopes that they come back? Well, in Dawn of Ulos, you can just sell them and make money. And then in addition, the biggest a company can get in this game is functionally 10 strength, meaning that it's always possible to topple a company no matter how large they've grown on the board, which Acquire doesn't let you do. At a certain point, they become too big to fail. There are a lot of interesting ideas. The package is really pretty. I like the hexes. I like a lot of the turn-to-turn decision-making. I have not played a game in at least 3 or 4 years that I feel like has a worse 3-player problem, which is that like when you play with 3 one person will get ahead, and then the other two will gang up on them, and that will go round robin until the game abruptly ends, and whoever was the last one to not get ganged up on will win the game, which we saw in our game to tremendous effect.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, like, it's a game that by necessity telegraphs which faction is, hey, this is the faction that we need to knock down. And you always have some sense of who's the most invested. One of the things I thought was weird is that, your shares, as it were, are not public. So there's always a little bit of like, well, I think Kellen has been picking up a lot of these cards, which is not really an exercise that I love at any point either. So there's this kind of this sense of knowing who to go for, but there's a little bit of lack of clarity as to that, and that is by design, but it sometimes just felt bad. Like, even as Christina and I are like ganging up on Kellen, there's a sense of like, oh, okay, great, through our combined efforts we've crashed Kellen's market all the way from the top down to 0, and now Christina and I are squabbling over the remains. And that's what the game wants, but again, like Kellen said, it felt very exacerbated at 3 players. I am intrigued by this at 4 or 5 players, which I've not tried it yet. I also like that in the game there are, I want to say there's probably like 10-ish different factions, and you just play with a random mix of 5 of them, so that kind of varies up the powers that are in your game at any given time. But at the same time, I didn't love some of the way that the powers kind of felt very situationally useful. Like, sometimes like one of the powers would just freely allow you to establish a conflict with any 2 factions on the board, and that just seemed weird to me in terms of like breaking down one of the core mechanics of the game. But regardless, it adds an interesting edge to it, one that I'm intrigued by. I don't know that I love it. I certainly think that in the realm of the sorts of stuff that like Restoration Games does, this felt like a cool way to bring back a older design and add some modern flavor to it.
It's certainly more interesting, right, than the riffraff that just gets shoveled out the doors these days from a lot of modern publishers. So at the very least, it's intriguing. I'm just not convinced that it all congealed. And especially along those powers. Those powers had wildly different. Some were
Absolutely
quite important, and others were like, why would anyone ever want to do this?
Totally. But yeah, that is Dawn of Ulos by Thunderworks Games.
Just a reminder here in the midcap that the podcast is now running every other week, meaning that the next episode of the show will come out on July the 20th. And now for today's featured topic, which was obviously inspired by us playing Dawn of Acquire. We are going to talk about game design, inspiration, reimplementations, and how the Pablo Picasso did not say that quote, Neelan. Did you Google it?
I haven't yet. I just took your word in it, Callan.
Never do that. There seems like after 280 of these, you would have learned that. I think that my first question to you two is, do you think that board games provide some kind of uniqueness over books, films, TVs, and novels that allow for this type of inspiration / reimplementation / taking the good bits and moving off? Is there anything novel or interesting about the way that board games do this?
I think so, because I think there's so much more room to play around with / obfuscate the inspiration when it comes to books and movies. Like, you can see like a Shakespearean play, or you can have a fairy tale as your inspiration, but you can add a lot of stuff. You can set in different places. You can do a lot of different things, and your end product can often be quite far away from the origination or the originating material. Whereas I think with board games, yeah, you can also have a different theme or add more bits, bolt on different mechanics or more mechanics. But the fact that board games are at their core a series of mechanisms, for the most part, I know that's really, really sort of paring it down, but I think it becomes a little more difficult to create a game inspired by another game that doesn't feel samey. Again, plenty of people have done it to very, very successful and much different extents, where the new game is a much different game than the older game. The most obvious example where it does feel very, very samey are games like Apples to Apples, where you get like Apples to Apples and you have a ton of different games that are doing the same, like voting.
After Dark.
Yeah, Apples to Apples After Dark. Of
Not
course,
Safe for Worse edition.
Cards Against Humanity. Crabs Adjust Humidity, which is a clone of those games. So you have all these games that have the same idea of try to make the person who is the judge in that round laugh and pick your cards. And so it feels so close in that respect to the originating game. Whereas, again, with books and movies, I think you can sort of separate yourself a little easier. At least it's always been my feeling about it.
Yeah, I think there's some extent to which it's very, very clear when a mechanic or a set of mechanics has come from another game. And that's not always to imply that that's always deliberate or intentional, but at the very least, there is something that's just more mathematically sound about like, hey, this set of systems or this set of mechanics being replicated in game to game versus, like you said, Mark, where you're dealing with story, where you're dealing with narrative or setting, there's more room to play with in differentiating that or just tweaking that or having it feel like, oh, this feels like this thing or evokes a thing, you know?
And I would even say that while it's easier in other media to be inspired and then have a product that comes out differently, I think if you hew too close to the originating material when it comes to books or movies or other media, that is definitely frowned upon. I think with board games, there is a level of acceptance that people are like, understand that iteration is like part of the culture, part of like the genre. So I think while it's more difficult to do it in board games, I think when you do like sort of piggyback and refine or iterate on something previous, I think it's way more accepted in the board game culture.
Yeah, and I think that that's comes down to some like legal things and then some just real life things. But I would say that one of the primary languages of film and books and art is characters and stories. And I would say that in the board game space, that is mechanisms. Right. And so in a movie, you know, you can't name your character Daniel Plainsview after There Will Be Blood has come out. Or I suppose you could in a meta sense, but there's more that can be copyrighted. I'm sure my language is different, where in the board game world, mechanisms are very clearly not to be copyrighted. The famous example is that Magic the Gathering had a patent on tapping lands. And so their energy system was, I don't know if it was a patent or they had some kind of way that no game designer was calling it tapping, even though they were using the exact same mechanism. So I guess all that to say, board games' primary method of which you interact with it is through mechanisms that cannot be copyrighted and are also simple by design, right? The whole point is to make them as simple as possible and to not obfuscate it. But I'd be curious, Neelan, you know, we're video game people. I was going to say we're video game devs, and then I realized you were going to laugh at me because I work at Activision.
I would never. I'm definitely one of those people that advocates that if you worked in a video game, you are a developer. So
well, I'll take it. Thank you, Neelan.
I made games on my Apple IIc back in the day. So I think I was the first developer of all three of you guys.
Mark, don't tell people how old you are. Trying to be relatable and young. But it's like, okay, Neelan, first-person shooters, right? No one would ever go, oh my God, you know, they're ripping them off. They're making a first-person shooter. And yet in board games, there's a little bit more, I don't know. It's probably best to get to some specific examples, right? Because it's like deck building, right, is probably the hugest one that we've seen evolve mechanically in our day. Yeah. Like, what's the difference there, if any?
I actually don't know that there is. And I also think that sometimes this is just a product of time, right? Because like I was very young, remember the beginnings of the first-person shooter genre, and like games that came out were like, even though this wasn't the first one, they were all called Doom clones, you know? There was just like this time where it's like, oh, if you were doing that, you were just copying Dune. And that
Metroidvania.
The way people
you ever hear of that?
Oh, say that again?
Metroidvania. I'm throwing out game terms here.
Exactly. Every Metroidvania, the game that comes out, it's one of those things where, like, I mean, that's actually a great example of a game. I mean, well, to be fair, Metroidvania is still used, but like, it feels like more like as time has gone on, that's just a language we use to talk about games, you know. And I think that was probably true of deck builders. I'm sure I remember conversations with you around the time that Puzzle Strike came out, and I was like, oh, this is just like a copy of mechanics from Dominion. And then you start to like realize, oh no, every other game is a deck builder in 2023, you know, and that doesn't feel like as criminal as that might have felt back in the day. Yeah, exactly, because it's just a product.
Picasso said we could do it.
Exactly.
But it's a little confounding to me, I guess, and we're going to get to some specific examples of games that have directly inspired other games. I think that's the meat and potatoes of this. But like, for instance, what do you call that? You know, I thought that you would call that a re-implementation, right? BGG has a specific group called re-implementation. And so a game can re-implement another game. But it seems like, for the most part, they use that tag when it's the same designer, which is probably not often how this works. I won't say that's how they use it every time, but often there are like named and unnamed, clearly, inspirations. So how do we refer to this? Because it's like, is it all above board, or is it sometimes done underhandedly?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. It's weird, right? Because I do wish, just from like an educative perspective, that BGG would definitely make that more apparent when there are, these delineations. But at the same time, I just can't imagine a world where that was possible, to like list every game that this game is inspiring or borrowing from. And I think that gets weirder in some ways than others, right? Like some specific examples. So right before we started recording, I had asked Mark about the relationship between Final Girl and Hostage Negotiator. Now, even though that there are some marked differences between the two games, there's a shared designer between the two, and there's a very obvious, hey, we wanted to take this game and re-theme it, re-implement it, expand on it. So that feels like exactly right for what BGG classifies as a re-implementation, and I would fully agree with that. That's how it's labeled on BGG. But it gets weirder when you're kind of, there's no real actual connection between the source game and the destination game.
I think a re-implementation is clear in my mind. A re-implementation is either by the same designer with the intention of sprucing up or re-theming or doing something else to their original design, or an explicit blessing by the designer for someone else to re-implement it. I think that's the only time you get a re-implementation. I think everything else is an inspiration or an iteration.
There's a lot of different words in the episode where we're talking about innovation. Yeah, no, I think that maybe I'm barking at the wrong tree, right? Because how could you clearly label what's the origination of the apples to apples style voting, and then does every game that uses that for the next 20 years need to say it's a re-implementation of the original? And often, one of the things that I think is fun to see, the fighting amongst like who did it first. It's like, well, actually, that was in this game, there was a card market row, blah, blah, blah. Ascension was the first, and like that gets pretty heated amongst us nerds.
Definitely, because I can imagine a world, for example, where I go to Kellen's place to teach him Dawn of Ulos. I get halfway through the rules and Kellen's just like, is this just Acquire? And I don't have an answer to that question, right? And that's a weird conversation to have. But, a very quick Google shows Jason Lentz talking about Acquire in the design of Dawn of Ulos. So like that answers that question very quickly. But it does get weird if you can't find that information. There's a lot that we wondered when we were playing Witchstone, which, has Reiner Knizia credited, but also is obviously a very, very clear implementation of Ingenious's like puzzle grid system. But like, how much Knizia is there in the rest of the design? Is Knizia just on the box because it was inspired by Ingenious? Like, where does Knizia fit into this pipeline at all? It's still pretty vague in the context of that game.
Ingenious is actually a funny one because there is a dispute over the name Ingenious. I believe the company that made the game got either a trademark or a copyright on the name Ingenious. So he then re-implemented it in a game called Axio, which we've covered previously on the pod, which has some new mechanisms, but is the same game just with squares. And then he went back and released Axio Horizontal or Axio Hexagonal, which is just literally Ingenious.
Amazing.
And so there's a little bit of, again, that's not exactly in the spirit of, but it's all in this muck and mire of who owns what and what's inspired by what, and is a game the mechanisms or the name of the system, in a way that I find really quite interesting. And maybe it's because there's so many ways you can take these base mechanisms, right? And, to make a video game, even an indie game, takes tremendous amounts of resources. And to make a board game, it starts as a variant, and even like Blood on the Clocktower, I hate to say it, has out loud said, like, this started 10 years ago as a werewolf variant. I was trying to clean up werewolf. And so is that spiritually inspired? I think that is 100%. But if we tag Blood on the Clocktower, all the people will come out and have some form of actually. Mafia has been played for thousands of years, Kellen.
I mean, you could say the same about the Resistance, right? I don't know that Don Eskridge has ever said as much, but there's a very obvious, like, hey, we played a lot of this style of Mafia or werewolf social deduction game and wanted to streamline it.
Yeah, and I think that's why the old person in me, hello, Mark, doesn't want to adjudicate it anymore. Because I would say that pre-podcast Kellen would start to argue with you a little bit, and the argument would be around like Resistance actually having more mechanical innovation in it than Blood on the Clocktower. And again, where that line is so different for every person. And you could like certainly make the counter argument that there's so much stuff in Blood on the Clocktower that obviously had to be designed. But like, even when No Pun Included did a video on like, was it the history of social deduction games or whatever, they like didn't include Resistance in a way that I felt like was missing. And again, I could be misremembering. I'm not trying to call them out. To me, the Resistance has this like new era of social deduction games that spawned a bunch of innovation. But because we can't define it together, like you basically just can't at all try to fight it from people and just sort of say everything is inspired by everything. We're all stealing from each other, as Picasso once said.
I have half a thought in my head that I want to run by you, which is this idea that if you take an existing game and add onto it, that feels somewhat more heavily inspired, or that sits less well than taking a game and then streamlining it, taking away from it.
That's interesting.
Interesting.
My gut feeling is to not agree with you because...
I mean, to be clear, I'm presenting that as like, how does that sit in your brain? Because like, I don't necessarily think one way or the other, because to me, design is as much adding as it is taking away.
Yeah. No, yeah, I think that I would be more, for what it's worth, more impressed and probably more likely to enjoy a game where a pre-existing game has been pared down, just because all else being equal, go towards simplicity. But I don't think that my moral judgment, I know you're not talking about moral judgments here, but my feeling as to which one is a more of an inspiration or a better inspiration or whatever, I don't think that it would be affected by whether it's like a add-on or a pared down. I think I would gravitate toward the latter, but I don't think there's like really too much of a difference.
Yeah. I think that where the moral judgment comes from is how often like rules variants are presented by someone where they're like, hey guys, like Bonanza is a classic game, but I added special player powers and like, who wants to play test this? And you just want to be like, F off, bro. Like, there is no time to play test your special version of X game with more in it.
Right.
It's like, oh, Axis and Allies would be great if we added a wizard unit and each part of, the people at D-Day had a wizard in the background. And you're like, no,
right.
I'm not going to do that. And so it feels less, but it's also like, I don't know that I've seen, and this may be where we get to the specific examples. I don't know that I've seen a game where it's like, this is that, but super pared down, that I can think of beyond like the Resistance as an example that we've already cited. Do you have any of those that come to mind?
Yeah, one that I have on my list here is like Dark Moon, right? So Dark Moon is pared down Battlestar Galactica for all intents and purposes. Like, this is originally literally pitched as BSG Express that then becomes and devolves into Dark Moon. And I don't know that necessarily nails everything I love about Battlestar Galactica for me personally, but that's definitely the idea behind it.
I wonder if the original Battlestar Galactica had any inspirations, because that system has been definitely redone in a couple of different ways where people are, contributing to these skill checks, right? Because isn't that how the Thing did it?
Yeah, to some extent. That feels a little bit closer to how like the Resistance works, but it is definitely like a somewhat of a hybrid of the two.
Yeah. I guess what makes me sheepish here, right? And this is an example we've cited before, and maybe I can be less sheepish given, and just so everyone knows, I'm stumbling over my words intentionally because I think it's funny. I have the perfect voice for podcasting, and I would never stumble if, Cthulhu Wars, right, is like definitely heavily and or non-heavily inspired by Chaos in the Old World, an Eric Lang game. But to my knowledge, that's not referenced anywhere.
Yeah.
And Peterson Games, may they rest in peace, doesn't, to my knowledge, cite it anywhere. And that, for whatever reason, that's always got me going a little bit. Just a little bit. I love Cthulhu, top 10 games of all time. You don't even want to get me started on Insider versus Werewords. But it's like, is there something about being above board about the stealing? Is that better?
Yeah,
I think so.
Yeah, again, I don't think I would call it stealing.
Well, Picasso would.
That's true. But yeah, I do always appreciate, I do think it's important to give an attribution to a work that you were inspired by. I'll never forget, and this is a super throwaway memory, but when I first opened up Nova Luna and seeing Uwe thank the creators of Habitats, I just thought it was a classy touch. And also, it's sort of like shines a light on someone who had their original idea iterated upon. And I think that's, again, legally, you don't even need to do that legally, but, it is that step that you go above and beyond. That is just like a nice, important thing that I think people should be doing.
Yeah, it's just classy. Like I love seeing the first page of a rule book that's like mentions the games that inspired it or the designers that inspired it. That's always something I love to see. Like, cite your sources. It feels like the good-spirited thing to do.
Yeah, speaking of Uwe, like the other game that pops to mind now is Lowlands. Seeing the designers of Lowlands thank Uwe for inspiring that game. And in fact, I think they had him look at it, one of the earlier versions of it before it was released. So that's just just again, acknowledgement of a prior master that you're sort of thanking, I think is always a nice touch.
Nova Luna as well, I would say, actually a pared down version of Habitats, now that I think about it.
And speaking of Eric Lang, his design of Chaos being iterated upon and not attributed by Peterson, Eric Lang has often cited El Grande as a inspiration for games like Blood Rage, those sort of area control games that he's sort of become master of and is quick to thank the Wolfgang design.
It's funny because when it's modern, it feels just a little more taboo, like we've talked about. But if it's like old, like how many games use poker hands, or like, my God, the trick-taking renaissance. Sure. Again, I love, it's like, is there an original trick-taking game that they should all cite?
Thanks.
That would be important.
Yeah, right.
For attribution. What other examples of this do we have spiritually inspired by?
So yeah, one other I have, because, it was a fairly high-profile game, but, I think Jamie was obviously very clear about the fact that Red Rising is fantasy realms, but with more stuff bolted onto it. I think a good example of where going in that direction doesn't always work for me, like adding complexity where the original didn't need the complexity.
Right.
All right, so we're going to end today with a little hot question.
A hot question.
And that question is, would you prefer, choose one, would you prefer a new game by one of your favorite designers that features mechanisms that are being touted as innovative, or a new game from one of your favorite designers that iterates or builds upon or spiritually is inspired by another game that you already have and love?
If you're telling me that someone is going to design Biblios 2, and like a real, don't give me Biblios dice, don't give me like Biblios Roll and Write.
What are you talking about?
For the King and Me, Mark.
What's that?
It's called For the King and Me.
No, and don't give me that either. But if you're going to, honestly, I know it's really easy to take shots at games that iterate, for sure. People call it lazy, people call it stealing and stuff like that. But, my favorite board games are my favorite for a reason. And if someone could take that and make it cool in a different way, I mean, the easy answer here is to say, yeah, of course, I want the new game. I want the brand new game. I want the fresh thing. But I like the games I like for a reason. And if somebody could take that and make something cool out of it, I would be interested in that. And I would say probably perhaps more interested in something that was completely novel, because I like this. I'm not going to pretend that I don't like these things.
Yeah, I think that that's largely true for me as well. I'm trying to think of examples for some of my favorite games. The only example I could think of is The Resistance, which evolved into Quest. But again, that's by Don Eskridge with some fiddling about by the developer, and that didn't work out great.
Vlada Chivalto is making a riff on A Feast for Odin.
Oh, I'm there 100%.
Yeah, see?
Are you kidding me? Yeah. Absolutely.
Martin Wallace is doing a Biblios. Reiner Knizia is doing a Biblios game. I'm like, oh my God.
Yeah. Reiner Knizia acquires Biblios license. We're just writing headlines here. People take them. We'll pay you. I think that the way I approach games is a smidgen different than you two, which is I'd rather have 50 total games with super varied experiences that are just that I would rather the swing and the miss of something completely new than, like someone like Stefan Feld, who I've come to appreciate much more, who's just sort of Again, I did a little bit of the twist there where you've got your favorite designer or a favorite designer working on a rev of something else, which is also fun. Now that sounds like a design jam, you know what I mean? Get all the 10 best designers, give them each other's games, and like in a weekend you have to come up with a different spin on this. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
But what do you think? We would love to hear about games that you see the inspiration from other games and how they're connected. It would be fun to make like a giant like mind map of it all. You know what I mean? Like it might be easier with deck building or bag building because Mark can't even name 5 of those. You could start with the mind map of bag building because it wouldn't be a very big map. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Board Game Barrage podcast. You can find us in all forms of social media. You can email us at boardgamebarrage@gmail.com. You can chat with us in Discord. Tell us about the mechanics that you're stealing for your upcoming masterpiece fanfic of Axis and Allies that we don't want to play. You can answer the hot question in our Facebook group or on our BGG Guild. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you to Heart Society Music for their fantastic intro and outro song, What's on Your Mind, Kid, from their album Wake the Queens. Thank you and good night.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.